The December cold had transformed London into a city of frost and shadow when three identical men arrived at Baker Street within hours of each other, each claiming to be the true heir to a substantial fortune, and each accusing the others of being impostors, bringing with them a mystery that would prove to be one of the most genealogically complex cases Sherlock Holmes ever investigated. Holmes, who had been conducting research into family resemblances and hereditary traits as part of his studies in criminal identification, work that would prove remarkably relevant to our investigation, looked up with immediate fascination as our first visitor entered. The man was perhaps 30 years old, well-dressed but showing signs of stress, with distinctive features that would soon become disturbingly familiar. Prominent cheekbones, unusual grey-green eyes, a small scar above the left eyebrow, and a particular way of holding his left hand, slightly curved, as if perpetually grasping something.
"Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he began with evident agitation. "My name is Edward Thornton, and I am the rightful heir to the Thornton estate worth over £100,000. My uncle, Lord James Thornton, died 3 weeks ago, leaving me as his sole surviving relative and heir. But when I went to claim my inheritance, I discovered something impossible. 2 other men, identical to me in appearance, both claiming to be Edward Thornton and both asserting their right to the estate. One of them must be an imposter, using theatrical makeup or prosthetics to impersonate me. I need you to expose these frauds before they steal my inheritance." Before I continue with this most extraordinary case, please subscribe to Detective Sherlock if you haven't already. Your support helps us bring these mysteries to life. Like this video, hit the notification bell, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let us proceed with the baffling mystery of the 3 identical strangers. Holmes studied our visitor with intense scrutiny. "You say these men are identical to you in appearance. Describe the extent of this resemblance." "Not just similar, completely identical," Edward insisted. "Same height, same build, same facial features, even the same scar above the left eyebrow that I received in childhood. When I first saw one of them at my uncle's estate, I thought I was looking in a mirror. The solicitors handling the estate are completely baffled. They cannot determine which of us is genuine." "How do you know you're the genuine Edward Thornton?" Holmes asked, with characteristic directness. The question seemed to momentarily confuse our visitor. "I know because I am myself. I have memories of my childhood, my education, my relationship with Uncle James. I know details about the Thornton family that only the real heir would know." "And do the other 2 claimants also possess such knowledge?" Holmes pressed. "That's what makes this so impossible," Edward replied. "When the solicitors questioned us, all 3 of us answered correctly about family history, childhood events, personal details. We all know things that supposedly only Edward Thornton would know. It's as if someone created perfect copies of me, complete with my memories and knowledge." Holmes was about to respond when Mrs. Hudson knocked and announced another visitor. A man claiming urgent need to see Holmes about a matter of stolen inheritance. When this second visitor entered, I felt a shock of recognition and disbelief. He was identical to Edward Thornton in every respect. The same distinctive features, the same scar, the same mannerism of holding his left hand curved. "Mr. Holmes," the second man began, then stopped abruptly upon seeing our first visitor. "What is this impostor doing here? I am Edward Thornton, the rightful heir."
"No, I am Edward Thornton," our first visitor interrupted, rising from his chair in agitation. "This man is a fraud," Holmes raised, his hand for silence. "Gentlemen, please, let me examine you both carefully before accusations continue." He approached the two identical men and studied them with his magnifying lens, comparing their features minutely. After several minutes of intense examination, he stepped back with a troubled expression I rarely saw on his face. "Dr. Watson, your medical opinion. Are these men identical?" I examined both men as thoroughly as Holmes had, comparing not just facial features, but also body structure, skin characteristics, even the patterns of veins visible on their hands. "They appear to be completely identical," I confirmed, "not just in general appearance, but in specific details. The same scar location and shape, the same unusual eye color, even similar dental characteristics. This level of resemblance is extraordinary." Before we could discuss further, Mrs. Hudson announced yet a third visitor, also claiming to be Edward Thornton and demanding to see Holmes about inheritance. Fraud. When this third man entered and proved to be identical to the other two, the situation crossed from remarkable to seemingly impossible. 3 men, completely identical in appearance, all claiming to be the same person, Holmes said, studying the trio with fascinated intensity. "This is unprecedented. Gentlemen, I'm going to ask each of you to provide detailed accounts of your life, your relationship with Lord James Thornton, and how you learned of your inheritance. I will compare your accounts and determine which contains truth and which deception." Over the following hours, Holmes interviewed each claimant separately and extensively. He asked about childhood memories, family events, education, career, personal relationships. Each man answered with confidence and detail, providing accounts that were largely consistent with each other, yet contained subtle differences in emphasis and perspective. The first Edward claimed he'd been raised in London, educated at Cambridge, and maintained close contact with Uncle James throughout his adult life, visiting the estate quarterly. The second Edward stated he'd been raised in Yorkshire, educated at Oxford, and had a somewhat distant relationship with Uncle James, visiting only annually but corresponding regularly. The third Edward insisted he'd been raised abroad in India, where his father had worked for the East India Company, educated privately by tutors, and had only recently returned to England after years of absence, learning of Uncle James's existence shortly before the old man's death. 3 completely different life stories, I observed after the interviews concluded. Yet all 3 men look absolutely identical, and all claim to be Edward Thornton. How is this possible? "It's possible," Holmes said slowly, "if all 3 men are telling versions of the truth. If Edward Thornton is not one person, but 3, if we're dealing with triplets separated at birth or early childhood, each raised in different circumstances, each believing himself to be the sole Edward Thornton, each unaware until now that identical brothers existed." The revelation was stunning. "Triplets," I repeated. "But wouldn't they have known? Wouldn't their parents have told them?" "Not if the separation was deliberate and secret," Holmes replied. "If someone had reason to separate 3 identical infant brothers and raise them in different locations under the same name, ensuring each believed himself unique, it would explain both the identical appearance and the different life stories. The question is, who would do such a thing, and why?"
Holmes immediately began investigating the Thornton family history, particularly focusing on the period around 30 years ago when the three Edwards would have been born. He examined birth records, baptismal certificates, family correspondence, and estate documents from that era. What he discovered was a tangled story of family tragedy and deliberate deception. 30 years ago, Lord James Thornton's brother, Robert, had married a woman named Margaret Hayes.
The marriage had been troubled from the start. Robert was unstable and violent, while Margaret came from a poor family and had married primarily for financial security. Margaret became pregnant and gave birth, not to one child, but to triplets, 3 identical boys. The birth had been attended only by a midwife who was paid generously to keep the multiple births secret. Lord James, who was then the family patriarch, had made an extraordinary decision. The 3 brothers would be separated, each raised in different circumstances, and only one would eventually be acknowledged as Robert's legitimate heir. "But why separate them?" I asked, confused by this bizarre arrangement. "Because Robert Thornton was mad," Holmes explained after reviewing medical records. He'd shown signs of severe mental instability, violent outbursts, paranoid delusions, episodes of complete irrationality. Lord James feared that madness might be hereditary, that Robert's sons might inherit his unstable temperament. By separating the triplets and raising them in different environments, Lord James believed he could determine which nephew would prove most stable and worthy of inheriting the family fortune. "He treated them like an experiment," I said with disgust. 3 children separated from birth, raised in ignorance of each other's existence, all for the purpose of selecting the best one as heir. Precisely. And to ensure fairness, or what Lord James considered fairness, he gave each boy the same name, Edward Thornton. Each was to be raised believing himself the sole heir. When Lord James eventually died, all 3 would discover each other's existence and learn the truth. Whichever Edward proved most capable, most stable, most worthy, would inherit the estate. Holmes's investigation uncovered the 3 separate households where the Edwards had been raised. The first Edward, raised in London, had been given to a respectable middle-class family with connections to Lord James. They were told they were raising the Thornton heir and provided with substantial funds for his education and upbringing. The second Edward, raised in Yorkshire, had been placed with a farming family, deliberately chosen to give him a more rugged, practical upbringing. They too were told they were raising the Thornton heir and given financial support. The third Edward, raised in India, had been sent overseas with a couple working for the East India Company. This was meant to give him international experience and test whether the Thornton temperament could thrive far from England. Each family was sworn to secrecy about the arrangement, Holmes explained. None of them knew about the other Edwards. Lord James maintained correspondence with all 3 households, monitoring each boy's development, tracking their progress through education and into adulthood. He kept detailed notes comparing their temperaments, abilities, and character. "And what did he conclude?" I asked. "That's the tragic irony. He never reached a conclusion. Lord James died suddenly 3 weeks ago before determining which Edward should inherit. His will simply states that,
My nephew Edward Thornton shall inherit the estate, without specifying which Edward. The solicitors discovered references to all three Edwards in Lord James's private papers, but found no final designation of a primary heir. So all three have equal claim to the inheritance, I observed. That's why this case is impossible to resolve. Legally, they're all Edward Thornton, all legitimate heirs, all entitled to the estate. Not quite, Holmes corrected. Only one Edward is Robert Thornton's biological son, and therefore the legitimate heir by blood. The question is, which one? Or are all three truly Robert's biological sons, making them equal heirs who must share the inheritance? Holmes's investigation took a darker turn when he examined the circumstances of the triplets' birth more carefully. He interviewed the elderly midwife who had attended Margaret Thornton's delivery 30 years ago, now living in a charity home and willing to finally tell the truth. There were 3 babies born that night, the midwife confirmed. 3 identical boys. But Lady Margaret died in childbirth. The delivery was difficult, the blood loss too severe. Lord James took the babies and told me I was never to speak of what happened. He paid me well for my silence. Did Robert Thornton ever see his sons? Holmes asked. No, Mr. Robert had been sent away. His madness had grown worse during his wife's pregnancy. Lord James had him committed to a private asylum. He never knew his wife died, never knew about his 3 sons. He died in that asylum 5 years later, still believing Margaret was alive somewhere and that he would see his family again someday. The tragedy of the Thornton family deepened with each revelation. 3 brothers, separated from birth, raised in ignorance of each other, all carrying the name Edward Thornton, but living completely different lives. One in London society, one in Yorkshire countryside, one in colonial India. Their father had died mad and alone, never meeting them. Their mother had died, giving them life. And their uncle had orchestrated this separation, not from cruelty, but from misguided belief that he could somehow prevent hereditary madness by controlling environment and selecting the most stable nephew as heir. But we still haven't answered the crucial question, I pointed out. Are all 3 truly Robert's biological sons? Could one or more have been substituted, either at birth or during the separation? If we can determine biological parentage definitively, we can identify the rightful heir. Holmes had already begun investigating this aspect. He obtained photographs of Robert and Margaret Thornton, comparing their features carefully with those of the 3 Edwards. All 3 showed strong resemblances to both parents: Robert's distinctive bone structure, Margaret's unusual eye colour. Physical resemblance suggests all 3 are genuine, Holmes observed, but we need more definitive evidence. Dr. Watson, I need you to conduct medical examinations of all 3 Edwards. Look for inherited characteristics, unique features, anything that might indicate whether they're truly identical triplets or whether substitution occurred. I examined each Edward thoroughly over the following days. The similarities were extraordinary, not just in facial features, but in body proportions, fingerprint patterns, even minor physical anomalies that suggested genetic relationship. All 3 had the same unusual eye color, the same distinctive pattern of hair growth, the same rare blood type. They're definitely related, I concluded. The probability of 3 unrelated individuals showing this many shared characteristics is astronomically small. They must be triplets. 3 brothers born of the same parents at the same time. But there's still the question of inheritance rights, Holmes said. Even if all three are Robert's biological sons, English law requires primogeniture. The firstborn son inherits. Among triplets, whichever was born first has legal precedence. The question becomes, which Edward was born first? Holmes returned to the midwife with this crucial question. She considered carefully, reaching back through 30 years of memory to that fateful night. The first baby born was the largest and strongest, she recalled. He came out crying loudly, fighting from the first moment. The second baby was quieter, more peaceful in temperament, even as a newborn. The third baby was smallest, struggled more to breathe, needed extra attention to survive those first hours. I remember because I worried we might lose the third one. He was so small and weak. Holmes asked her to describe any identifying marks on the babies. The first baby had a small birthmark on his left shoulder, a dark patch shaped like a crescent moon. I noticed it specifically because it was unusual. The other two babies had no birthmarks that I saw. With this information, Holmes arranged for all three Edwards to be examined for the birthmark. The examination revealed that the Edward raised in London had a small, crescent-shaped birthmark on his left shoulder, exactly as the midwife had described. According to the midwife's testimony, you were born first, Holmes told the London Edward. By law of primogeniture, you are the primary heir to the Thornton estate. Your brothers, as younger sons, have no legal claim to the inheritance unless you choose to share it with them. The resolution should have brought clarity, but instead it created an ethical dilemma. The three Edwards, brothers who had never known of each other's existence until weeks ago, now faced the question of what to do with an inheritance that legally belonged to ne'er one but morally implicated all three. "We're brothers," the Yorkshire Edward said during a meeting Holmes arranged between the three. "We shared the same womb, the same blood, the same parents. The accident of who was born 10 minutes before the others shouldn't determine who inherits everything while the others receive nothing." "But that's what the law requires," the London Edward replied, though his tone was uncertain. "I didn't ask to be born first or to be designated sole heir. But if the law says the inheritance is mine, what choice do I have?" "You have the choice to be a brother instead of a stranger," the India Edward said quietly. "We've all lost our parents, been raised in ignorance of our true family, been manipulated by an uncle who saw us as experimental subjects rather than human beings. We can continue that legacy of separation and competition, or we can choose to be the family we never got to have." Holmes observed this exchange with interest, but did not intervene. "The legal question is resolved," he said. "The London Edward is the legitimate primary heir. But the moral question, how three brothers should relate to each other after learning of their existence, that's not something I can solve with deduction and evidence. That's a choice the three of you must make." The resolution came gradually. The three Edwards spent weeks together, sharing their life stories, discovering similarities and differences in their experiences. They found they had similar mannerisms, similar ways of thinking, even similar interests despite their different upbringings, testament to the power of heredity that Lord James had sought to overcome through environmental manipulation. Eventually, they reached an agreement. The inheritance would be divided equally among the three brothers. The London Edward, as legal primary heir, would formally inherit the estate, then deed equal thirds to his brothers. Together, they would manage the Thornton properties and investments, treating each other as equal partners rather than primary heir and dependent younger siblings. "We're choosing to be brothers," the London Edward explained to Holmes, when they formalized this arrangement. We can't recover the 30 years we lost, the childhood we should have shared, the family we should have been, but we can choose how we go forward from here. Lord James tried to determine which of us was most worthy of being a Thornton heir. We've decided we're all equally worthy, not because of individual merit, but because we're brothers, and that bond matters more than accidents of birth order or upbringing. The case of the three identical strangers entered my notes as one of Holmes's most emotionally complex investigations. It demonstrated that genetic identity, the physical resemblance among triplets, was undeniable, but personal identity, the experiences and relationships that make each person unique, were shaped by environment and choice. 3 identical bodies, 3 different lives, Holmes reflected after the case concluded. Lord James's experiment proved nothing about heredity versus environment, because he never allowed the comparison to reach completion. But the brothers themselves proved something more important, that family can be chosen as well as inherited, that the bond of shared blood can be stronger than years of separation, and that legal inheritance matters less than human connection. The case influenced subsequent legal treatment of multiple births and inheritance rights. Questions about primogeniture among triplets had rarely been addressed in English law, because such births were uncommon and separation even more rare. The Thornton case established precedents about how to determine birth order and inheritance rights when multiple identical heirs existed. Years later, the 3 Edward Thorntons remained close, managing the family estate cooperatively and creating the family relationship they'd been denied in childhood. They married, had children, and ensured that their children grew up knowing their cousins, the extended Thornton family that Lord James's misguided experiment had tried to prevent. The irony is that Lord James feared hereditary madness, I observed to Holmes years later. He separated 3 brothers to prevent the possibility that all might be unstable like their father. Instead, his experiment in separation was itself a form of madness. The belief that human beings could be controlled and shaped like laboratory specimens, rather than loved as family. And yet, Holmes replied, the experiment wasn't entirely without value. The 3 Edwards, raised in completely different circumstances, all developed into capable, moral individuals. Whatever hereditary temperament they inherited from Robert Thornton, it didn't manifest as madness. Perhaps Lord James's fears were unfounded, or perhaps the loving environments he arranged for each nephew, despite the deception, prevented the expression of any problematic inheritance. The case remained one of my favorite investigations to recall because it showed that even the most extraordinary mysteries, 3 identical strangers, each claiming to be the same person, could be explained through family secrets and human choices rather than supernatural impossibility. When faced with identical appearance, identical claims, identical evidence, Holmes told me, the detective's task is to look beyond surface identity, to uncover the truth of relationship and history. The 3 Edwards were identical in appearance, but each was genuinely who he claimed to be: Edward Thornton, Robert's son, Margaret's child. The mystery wasn't which one was real, but rather how 3 real people could exist where everyone expected only one. The answer lay not in deception, but in a family tragedy that began before any of the Edwards were old enough to remember. A separation imposed by well-meaning interference that tried to control fate,
and instead created three separate fates that eventually converged. The three identical strangers who had arrived at Baker Street as rivals competing for an inheritance left as brothers sharing an unexpected family. Their story demonstrated that identity is complex, simultaneously genetic and environmental, inherited and chosen, singular and shared. They were identical and yet unique, the same and yet different, strangers and yet family. And in choosing to share rather than compete, to connect rather than separate, to be brothers rather than strangers, they wrote the final chapter of Lord James Thornton's experiment, proving that human connection triumphs over circumstantial separation, that family bonds can form even between those who meet as adults, and that the accident of identical appearance can become the foundation of genuine identical purpose. The three Edwards who should have been one became three who chose to be united, a resolution that satisfied both law and morality, genetics and ethics, inheritance and brotherhood.